The land remembers. The high desert holds memory differently than softer country. It keeps what the wind cannot take. Bone, iron, the black scar of a campfire 10 years cold. That morning the land lay silent, under a sky so pale it seemed the color had been prayed out of it. No clouds, no birds yet. Just the long roll of sage and rock, stretching west toward mountains that had no name anyone remembered. She came up the trail just after dawn, when the light was still pink along the edges of the mesas. A woman alone, not young, not old, leading a mule that limped on its off rear leg. The mule carried a pack, a water barrel, and a rolled canvas that might have been a tent or might have been a shroud. She did not hurry. There was no one waiting. Her name was Marian Wed, though she had not spoken it aloud in 4 months. She wore a man's coat too large in the shoulders, and her braid had come half undone in the night. Just lay in the creases of her knuckles. She had been a schoolteacher once, in a town south of the territorial line, before the fever came through, before the school bell rang over empty desks, before the church filled with small bodies and then emptied again, into the ground. She did not think about that now. Thinking had no place on a trail this narrow. She watched the mule's hoof, the way it dragged a little in the gravel. She watched the sky for the hawks that sometimes followed travelers, waiting. She watched the road. Ahead, a mile off, the town of Cibola stood like a broken tooth against the pale morning. It was not much. A mercantile, a livery, a squat adobe church with no cross on the roof. A dozen low buildings the color of mud, hunched together as if for warmth. Smoke rose from one chimney. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped. Miriam had not meant to stop there. She had been traveling north and west with no destination, only the need to be elsewhere, to be no one. But the mule was lame, and her water was nearly gone, and the next town was 2 days on. She would stop. She would buy what she needed. She would not stay. The road widened as it approached the town. Ruts from wagon wheels, hoof prints, the drag marks of something heavy pulled by hand. On either side the ground was hard-packed and bare, dotted with the gray-green of creosote bushes. The air smelled like dust and distance. She came into the edge of town and stopped. The street was empty, but she could feel eyes on her from the windows. A woman alone was always a question. She led the mule toward the livery, her boots silent in the dirt. The livery doors were open. Inside, a man knelt beside a broken wheel, his hands black with axle grease. He looked up when her shadow crossed the threshold, squinted, then looked down again. "Mule's lame," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, like something dug up. The man wiped his hands on a rag and stood. He was older, maybe 60, with a limp of his own and a face like saddle leather. He walked around the mule without touching it, bent to look at the hoof. "Stone bruise," he said. "Need to rest her 3 days, maybe 4. Miriam felt the words settle heavy in her chest. 3 days, 4. "I can pay," she said. "Didn't say you couldn't." He led the mule into a stall and brought it water. Miriam stood in the doorway and watched the street. A woman in a faded blue dress hurried past, a basket on her hip. 2 men stood outside the mercantile, speaking low. One of them looked toward the livery, then away. "There a place I can sleep?" Miriam asked. The liveryman shook his head. "No boarding house. Church sometimes takes folks in. Is the Padres willing?" Miriam did not want the church. She had spent enough time in churches. "Any place else?" The man paused, thinking. Then he nodded toward the back of the livery. "Got a tack room. Ain't much, but it's dry. 2 bits. A night." "All right." He showed her the room. It was small, barely wider than her shoulders, with a dirt floor and a single narrow window. Leather straps hung on the walls, and the air smelled of oil and old sweat. But there was a bench, and the door had a latch. She set her pack down and untied the canvas roll. Inside was a blanket, a tin plate, a small knife, and a book with no cover. She did not open the book. She spread the blanket on the bench and sat, her back against the wall. Through the window she could see a corner of the street, the edge of the church, and beyond that the open land running out toward nothing. The sky was full light now, white and flat. Somewhere a hammer rang against metal, slow and steady. Miriam closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She only sat, listening to the sounds of a town that did not know her and did not need to. She had learned to be small. She had learned to take up no space. It was easier that way, safer. But the desert does not forget, and neither did the town. By noon, word had spread. A woman alone. No husband, no kin, no story anyone could see. And in a town like Cibola, a woman like that was either a question or an answer. Most folks had not decided which. The encounter. Miriam woke to voices. Not close, but not far either. She sat up on the narrow bench, her neck stiff, and listened. Men's voices, several of them, somewhere out in the street. A low rumble, like the sound before a storm. She stood and went to the window. The light had changed. It was late afternoon now, the sun slanting hard and orange across the rooftops. The street was no longer empty. A crowd had gathered near the center of town, maybe 20 people, maybe more. They stood in a loose half-circle, facing something she could not see. Miriam stepped out of the tack room and crossed through the livery. The liveryman was gone. The mule stood quiet in its stall, head low. She walked to the wide doors and stopped just inside the shadow, where she could see but not be seen. The crowd had gathered around the old well platform in the middle of the street. But there was no well anymore. Someone had built a cage there instead. Iron bars, thick as a man's wrist, set into a wooden frame and sunk deep into the ground. And inside the cage, a man. He sat on the bare ground, with his back against the bars. His legs drawn up, his head resting on his knees. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and his hair hung long and dark, unwashed. His hands were empty. He did not move. A boy, no older than 10, threw a stone. It struck the bars and rattled loud. The man in the cage did not look up. "Do it again," someone said, laughing. The boy picked up another stone. "Leave him be," a woman's voice said, sharp. The boy hesitated, then dropped the stone and stepped back into the crowd. Miriam stood very still. She did not know what the man had done, or what he was accused of doing. She did not know his name. But she knew the shape of this. She had seen it before, in other towns, other roads. A man in a cage was a man the law had not bothered to hang yet, either because they were waiting for something, or because the waiting itself was the punishment. One of the men near the front of the crowd spat into the dust. He was thick across the chest, with a gray beard and a star pinned to his vest. The sheriff, or what passed for one. 3 days now, the sheriff said to no one in particular. Still won't talk. Maybe he can't, another man said. Maybe he don't want to. Don't matter. Judge'll be here end of the week. He'll talk then, or he'll swing quiet. The crowd murmured. A few people drifted away. Others stayed, watching, as if the man in the cage were a picture at a fair. Miriam felt something tighten in her chest. She told herself it was not her concern. She told herself to go back to the tack room, to wait out the days until the mule was sound, and then to leave. She had no stake in this town. She had no weight to throw. A woman alone had no voice that anyone would hear. But she did not move. The sun dropped lower, the crowd thinned. By the time the light turned red along the horizon, only a few stragglers remained. The man in the cage had not moved. He sat with his head down, his breathing slow, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Miriam waited until the street was empty. Then she stepped out of the livery and walked toward the cage. Her boots made no sound. The air had cooled, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and sagebrush. She stopped a few feet from the bars and stood there, uncertain. The man did not look up. She studied him. He was younger than she had thought, maybe 30, maybe less. His hands were calloused, scarred across the knuckles. His feet were bare. There was a bruise along his jaw. Dark and old. He looked like someone who had been fighting for a long time and had finally stopped. Miriam glanced back toward the street. No one was watching. She crouched down and set her canteen on the ground, then pushed it forward with her fingertips until it rolled against the bars. The man lifted his head. His eyes were dark, watchful. He looked at the canteen, then at her. He did not speak. Miriam stood. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She turned and walked back toward the livery, her heart loud in her ears. Behind her, she heard the faint scrape of metal on wood, the sound of the canteen being pulled through the bars. She did not look back. That night, she lay on the bench in the tack room and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the man in the cage. She thought about the boy with the stone. She thought about the way the crowd had stood there, watching, as if cruelty were a kind of entertainment. She thought about the fever, and the school, and the small graves in a row. She had not been able to stop that. She had not been able to save anyone. But this was different. This was a man, and a cage, and a choice. Miriam closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She listened to the wind moving through the eaves, and the distant bark of a dog, and the silence that sat heavy over Sibylla like a thing waiting. By morning, she had made a decision. She did not know yet what it would cost. She only knew she could not walk away. The land remembers, and so do people. And Miriam Webb had remembered enough to know what forgetting looked like. The unspoken pact. Miriam woke before dawn and walked to the mercantile as soon as the door was unlatched. The man behind the counter was thin and pale, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He watched her as she moved through the narrow aisles, picking up a small loaf of bread, a tin of salt pork, and a cloth sack of cornmeal. She set the items on the counter and counted out coins from the small leather pouch she kept in her coat pocket. The man took the money without a word, but his eyes lingered on her face. "You the one staying at the livery?" he asked. "I am." He nodded slowly, wrapping the bread in brown paper. "Mule still lame?" "Yes." "Shame," he said, though his tone suggested he did not think it was a shame at all. He handed her the parcels. "You be careful, ma'am. Town's got a mood about it these days." Miriam met his eyes. "What's the man in the cage done?" The mercantile keeper glanced toward the window, then back. "Don't know that he's done anything. That's the trouble." "Then why's he there?" The man shrugged. "Sheriff says he rode in 4 days back. No name, no word. Wouldn't say where he came from or where he was going. Someone said they saw a brand on his saddle, army brand, but the saddle's gone now. Sheriff thinks he's a deserter. Or worse. And if he's not?" The man's mouth ticked. "Saint? My business to say." Miriam kicked up her parcels and left. The street was still empty, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. She walked past the church, past the low adobe houses with their shuttered windows, and stopped at the edge of the well platform. The man in the cage was awake. He sat with his back to the bars, his arms resting on his knees. The canteen lay beside him, empty. Miriam approached slowly. She set the parcels on the ground and unwrapped the bread. She tore it in half, then pushed one piece through the bars. The man looked at the bread, then at her. "You should eat," she said quietly. He did not move. Miriam waited. The sky grew lighter. Somewhere a rooster crowed, thin and distant. Finally, the man reached out and took the bread. He ate slowly, carefully, as if he had forgotten how. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at her again. "Why?" he asked. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. Miriam did not know how to answer. She thought about the question for a long time, standing there in the cool morning air with the wind beginning to stir. "Because no one else will," she said at last. The man studied her. Then he nodded, just once, and looked away. Miriam picked up the other half of the bread and walked back to the livery. She did not look back, but she felt his eyes on her until she disappeared through the doors. The next morning she came again. This time she brought water and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She did not speak. She simply set the items within reach of the bars and stepped back. The man took them without a word. On the third morning, she brought cornmeal mixed with water into a thick paste, cooked over the small fire she had built behind the livery. It was not much, but it was warm. She pushed the tin plate through the bars and watched as he ate. When he was finished, he set the plate down and looked at her. "They're going to hang me," he said. Miriam felt the words settle in her chest like stones. "What did you do?" "Nothing they can prove." "That doesn't answer the question." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I left. That's all. I left, and they don't forgive that." "Left what?" He shook his head. "Doesn't matter now." Miriam wanted to press, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into fists. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who had said all he could. She picked up the empty plate and turned to go. "What's your name?" the man asked. She stopped. For a moment she considered not answering. A name was a thing that tied you to a place, to a past. She had been trying to shed hers like an old skin. But something in his voice made her turn back. "Miriam," she said. He nodded. "I'm Samuel." She did not ask for a last name. She did not need one. That afternoon, the sheriff came to the livery. Miriam was brushing down the mule when his shadow filled the doorway. "Heard you've been feeding the prisoner," he said. Miriam did not look up. "Is that against the law?" "No, but it's curious. He's a man. Men need to eat. The sheriff stepped inside, his boots heavy on the packed dirt floor. He was a big man, broad and solid, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "You know him?" the sheriff asked. "No." "Then why?" Miriam set down the brush and turned to face him. "Why not?" The sheriff's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You're a strange woman. I've been called worse." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Judge comes in 2 days. After that, it's out of my hands. And if the judge finds him innocent, he won't." The sheriff turned and walked out, his shadow shrinking as he moved into the light. Miriam stood alone in the livery, her hands shaking. She did not know what she had expected. She did not know what she could do, but she knew she could not stop now. That night she brought Samuel a blanket. It was her own, the one she had been sleeping under, but the nights were getting colder, and he had nothing. She pushed it through the bars without a word. Samuel took it and held it in his hands, staring at it as if he had never seen such a thing before. "Thank you," he said. Miriam nodded. Then she turned and walked back into the dark. The echo of the past the morning the judge was meant to arrive. Miriam found Samuel carving something into the dirt floor of the cage with a bent nail. She stood at a distance, watching the careful movements of his hand, the way he paused and then continued, as if the marks carried weight. When he noticed her, he stopped and pushed the dirt smooth with his palm, erasing whatever he had written. She approached with a tin cup of water and the last of the cornmeal. She pushed them through the bars and crouched down, her knees aching from the cold that had settled into the ground overnight. "What were you writing?" she asked. Samuel looked at her, bent down at his hands. "A name." "Yours?" "No." He did not elaborate, and Miriam did not press. She waited, watching the way the early light caught in his dark hair, the way his shoulders held a tension that never seemed to leave. After a long silence, he spoke again. "Had a brother once, younger. He followed me everywhere, even when I told him not to." Samuel's voice was quiet, distant. "We signed up together, him and me. Army needed bodies and we needed pay. He was 17, lied about his age." Miriam felt her chest tighten. She knew where this was going. "They sent us west," Samuel continued, "said we were keeping the peace. But there wasn't any peace to keep. Just orders that didn't make sense and people dying for no reason anyone could name." He paused, his hands curling into fists. "My brother, he got sick first week. Fever. I asked the captain to let him rest, to let him recover in camp. Captain said no. Said we had a march to make." The wind picked up, stirring dust around the cage. "He died on the road," Samuel said. "Fell off his horse and didn't get back up. They didn't even stop. Just kept moving. I had to leave him there." Miriam closed her eyes. She saw the schoolhouse, the rows of small desks, the children who had come to her every morning with their slates and their bright faces. She saw the fever moving through them like a shadow, taking them one by one, while she stood helpless, wringing out cloths and whispering prayers that went unanswered. "I buried him myself that night," Samuel said. "Went back and dug the grave with my hands. No marker, no words, just dirt." He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw. "I left the next morning, took my horse and rode. Didn't matter where, they'll call it desertion. Maybe it was, but I couldn't stay." Miriam opened her eyes and met his gaze. "What was his name?" "Thomas." She nodded slowly. The name hung in the air between them, small and sacred. "I had students," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. 32 of them. There was a fever 2 winters ago. It came through fast. We tried everything. Every remedy anyone knew. Didn't matter." She stopped, her throat closing. "I lost 16 of them in 3 weeks." Samuel watched her, his expression unreadable. "There was a girl," Miriam continued. "Her name was Anna. She was 8 years old, and she loved to read. She'd stay after school sometimes, just to sit in the corner with a book. When she got sick, her mother brought her to me, because the doctor had too many others. I sat with her for 2 days, held her hand, read to her." Miriam's voice broke. "She died in my arms." The silence that followed was heavy and long. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a door slammed. "I left after that," Miriam said. "Couldn't stand to look at those empty desks, couldn't stand to hear the bell ring and know no one was coming." She looked down at her hands, rough and cracked from the road. "People said I should have stayed, said the town needed a teacher, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. Samuel nodded. You carry them with you. Yes. The names. Yes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a tin button, tarnished and dented, with the faint impression of an eagle on its face. This was his, Samuel said. Only thing I kept. Miriam looked at the button, then reached into her own coat and drew out a small ribbon, faded blue, tied in a careful bow. This was hers, she said. Anna's mother gave it to me after the funeral. Said Anna would have wanted me to have it. They sat in silence, each holding their fragments of the dead. After a while, Samuel folded the cloth back over the button and returned it to his pocket. Miriam tied the ribbon around her wrist, where it had been before, hidden under her sleeve. The judge won't care, Samuel said quietly, about Thomas or why I left. He'll just see a deserter. I know. And you can't stop it. Miriam looked at him, at the bars between them, at the bruises on his arms, and the exhaustion in his face. Maybe not, she said. But I can stand here. Samuel's expression softened, just slightly. Why? Miriam thought about Anna, about the schoolhouse, about all the times she had been too late, too small, too powerless to change anything. She thought about the weight of names carried in secret, and the way grief could make a person disappear. Because someone should, she said. Samuel nodded. He did not thank her. He did not need to. The sun climbed higher. Miriam stood and picked up the empty cup. She walked back toward the livery, the ribbon warm against her wrist, and did not look back. Behind her, Samuel knelt in the dirt and began carving again. This time, he did not erase it. The name Thomas appeared in careful, crooked letters, pressed into the ground, as if the earth itself might remember. The test of fire. The judge arrived at noon, on a horse too fine for the country it was crossing. He was a narrow man with silver hair and a coat that had been brushed clean of dust, though the road behind him was nothing but dust for 30 miles. The sheriff met him in the street, and the two of them stood talking in low voices while the town gathered. Miriam watched from the livery door. She had not slept. Her hands ached from gripping the edge of the bench all night, and her mouth was dry. The mule stood quiet in its stall, its leg finally sound. But she had not packed. She had not prepared to leave. By early afternoon, a makeshift court had been assembled in front of the church. Someone had dragged out a table and 2 chairs. The judge sat in one, a leather book open in front of him. The sheriff stood to his right. A crowd of 30 or more pressed close, their faces eager and hungry for the shape of justice, or what passed for it. Samuel was brought out of the cage in irons. His wrists were shackled in front of him, and his ankles were chained so he could only take short, shuffling steps. He did not resist. He walked with his head down, his hair falling across his face. They sat him in the empty chair. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then opened the leather book and began to read from a page already marked. You are accused of desertion from the United States Army, the judge said, his voice flat and formal. The penalty for such an offense, in times of active service, is death by hanging. Do you deny the charge? Samuel lifted his head. No. A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge made a note in the book. Do you wish to offer explanation or defense? Samuel was quiet. Miriam could see his jaw working, the way his hands clenched in the irons. No, he said finally. The judge nodded, as if this was expected. Then the court finds you guilty as charged. Sentence to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others muttered prayers. A few women turned away, pulling their children close. Miriam felt the ground tilt beneath her. She stepped out of the livery, her legs shaking, and walked toward the gathering. People turned to look at her. The judge glanced up. Wait, Miriam said. Her voice cracked, but she forced it louder. Wait. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand on his belt. Ma'am, this is a legal proceeding. You need to step back. He's not a coward, Miriam said. She was close enough now that she could see Samuel's face, the way his eyes widened slightly when he saw her. He left because his brother died. He left because the army wouldn't let him bury his own blood. The judge frowned. That does not change the law. Then the law is wrong. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. The sheriff moved toward her, but the judge raised a hand. Mrs., the judge began. Miss, Miriam said. Miss Webb. Miss Webb, the judge continued, his tone careful. I understand your sympathy, but desertion is desertion. Motive does not absolve the act. Then what does? Miriam asked. Her voice was shaking now, but she did not stop. He lost his brother. He buried him alone. And when he couldn't stand it anymore, he left. That's not cowardice. That's grief. The judge closed the book slowly. The law does not account for grief. Maybe it should. The sheriff took Miriam by the arm, firm but not rough. That's enough, he said quietly. You've said your piece. Now go. Miriam pulled her arm free and turned to Samuel. He was staring at her, his face unreadable. I'm sorry, she said. Samuel shook his head, just slightly. Don't be. The sheriff motioned to two men standing nearby, and they took Samuel by the arms and lifted him to his feet. They began to lead him back toward the cage. The crowd started to disperse. The judge packed his book into a leather satchel and stood, brushing dust from his coat. Miriam stood alone in the street, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. She had done nothing. She had changed nothing. The sentence would be carried out at dawn, and Samuel would die, and the world would go on as if he had never been in it. She turned and walked back toward the livery, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. But before she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. Miss Webb. She stopped and turned. It was the woman from the mercantile, the one who had told the boy to stop throwing stones. She was older, maybe 50. With gray streaks in her dark hair and a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. That was a brave thing you did, the woman said. Miriam shook her head. It didn't matter. It mattered to him. Miriam looked past her, toward the cage where Samuel now sat, hunched and silent. There's nothing more I can do, Miriam said. The woman stepped closer, her voice dropping. Maybe there is. Miriam looked at her sharply. What do you mean? The woman glanced around, then leaned in. The sheriff leaves the keys in his office at night, hangs them on a nail by the door. Everyone knows it. He's not a careful man. Miriam felt her heart begin to pound. You're asking me to... I'm not asking anything, the woman said. I'm just telling you where the keys are. She turned and walked away before Miriam could respond. Miriam stood in the street as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the dust. The town grew quiet. Doors closed. Lamps were lit in windows. She thought about the keys. She thought about the cage. She thought about the long road north and the mule that was finally sound enough to travel. She thought about Anna and the schoolhouse and all the times she had been too afraid to act. And she thought about Samuel, sitting alone in the dark, waiting for a dawn that would be his last. Miriam went back to the tack room and sat on the bench. She did not light a lamp. She simply sat in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, and waited for the town to fall asleep. When the moon rose high and the street was silent, she stood and walked out into the night, the quiet aftermath. The sheriff's office was a small adobe building with a single window and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Miriam approached it from the side, staying in the shadows, her breath shallow and quick. The street was empty. The only sound was the wind moving through the eaves and the distant yip of a coyote somewhere out beyond the edge of town. She pressed her hand against the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the office smelled of tobacco and old leather. A single desk sat against the far wall, covered with papers and a tin cup half filled with cold coffee. A gun belt hung from a peg. And there, on a nail beside the doorframe, a ring of iron keys. Miriam's hand shook as she reached for them. The metal was cold and heavy. She slipped the ring into her coat pocket and stepped back outside, pulling the door closed as quietly as she could. She moved quickly across the street toward the cage. Samuel was awake. He sat with his back against the bars, his arms wrapped around his knees. When he saw her, he straightened. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Miriam did not answer. She knelt beside the cage door and fumbled with the keys, trying each one in the lock. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold them steady. The third key turned. The lock clicked open, loud in the silence. Miriam pulled the door wide and stepped back. Samuel stared at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "Go," she said. He did not move. "They'll hang you instead. They won't know it was me." "They will." Miriam met his eyes. "Then let them." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I can't let you do this. It's already done. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Samuel rose to his feet, his legs unsteady, and stepped out of the cage. He stood in the street, free, and looked around as if he could not quite believe it. Miriam took his arm. My mule is in the livery. Take her. She's sound now. Ride north and don't stop. Samuel looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. Come with me. Miriam felt the words settle in her chest like a stone. She had not expected them. She had not let herself imagine them. I can't, she said. Why not? Because they'll come after us both. But if I stay, if I'm here when they find the cage empty, maybe they'll believe I had nothing to do with it. Samuel's jaw tightened. You're lying. Maybe. He reached up and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm. I won't leave you here to face this alone. You have to. No. Miriam pulled her hand free, her throat tight. Samuel, please, don't make this harder than it is. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. Then he shook his head. If you stay, I stay. I'm not running anymore, Samuel said, his voice quiet but firm. I ran once and it didn't save anyone. It didn't save Thomas. It won't save you. Miriam felt tears prick her eyes. She turned away, wiping at them with the back of her hand. Then what do we do? Samuel looked around the empty street, then back at the open cage. We leave together, both of us, right now. They'll catch us. Maybe, but at least we'll have tried. Miriam closed her eyes. She thought about the schoolhouse, about the children she could not save, about the years she had spent running from the weight of their names. She thought about the ribbon tied around her wrist and the way grief had hollowed her out until there was nothing left but motion. And she thought about Samuel standing in front of her, choosing to stay when he could have run. She opened her eyes. All right. They moved quickly. Miriam led Samuel to the livery and saddled the mule while he kept watch at the door. She gathered her pack, the blanket, the small sack of cornmeal. She did not have much. She had learned to travel light. Samuel found a second horse in one of the stalls, a roan gelding that belonged to the liveryman. He did not ask permission. There was no time. They led the animals out into the street and mounted. The moon was high and bright, casting everything in silver. Miriam looked back at the town one last time. The low buildings, the church, the cage standing empty and open like a mouth. Then she turned the mule north and rode. They traveled through the night, following a narrow trail that wound through the sage and rock. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves on hard ground and the wind moving through the darkness. By dawn, they had covered 10 miles. The sky began to lighten in the east, pale and cold. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop beside a dry creek bed and dismounted. Miriam followed. They stood together in the growing light, breathing hard, their faces lined with exhaustion. They'll come after us, Miriam said. I know. We can't stop. I know. Samuel looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. It was small and brief, but it was real. Thank you, he said. Miriam shook her head. Don't thank me yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tin button, the one that had belonged to his brother. He held it out to her. What's this for? Miriam asked. So you know I'm not running, Samuel said. So you know I'm with you, whatever comes next. Miriam looked down at the button, tarnished and worn, and felt something crack open in her chest. She took it carefully and closed her hand around it. Then she reached up and untied the ribbon from her wrist. She held it out to him. Then you take this, she said, so you know you're not alone. Samuel took the ribbon and tied it around his own wrist, fumbling with the knot until it held. They stood in the dry creek bed as the sun rose, two people carrying the weight of the dead, bound now by something fragile and new, the choice to stay or leave. They rode for 3 days, keeping to the narrow trails that wound through the high country, where the sage gave way to juniper, and the air grew thin and cold. They saw no one. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by the dark shapes of mesas rising against the sky. On the third night, they made camp in a shallow canyon where a spring pooled among the rocks. Samuel built a small fire while Miriam tended to the animals, checking their hooves and rubbing down their coats with handfuls of dry grass. The work was familiar, soothing. It gave her hands something to do besides shake. They ate in silence, sharing the last of the cornmeal, cooked into a thick paste over the fire. When the food was gone, Samuel leaned back against a building and stared into the flames. We can't keep running, he said finally. Miriam looked up, What do you mean? I mean we're heading nowhere, just away. He gestured toward the dark hills surrounding them. Eventually we'll run out of country, or they'll catch us, or winter will. Miriam knew he was right. She had been pushing the thought away for 3 days, focusing only on the next mile, the next camp, the next dawn. But the truth was they had no destination. They were running, and running had no end. What are you saying? She asked. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night. I'm saying maybe we stop, he said. Maybe we find a place and stay. They'll find us. Maybe, maybe not. He looked at her across the fire, his face half in shadow. But if we keep running, we're just going to die tired. Miriam felt a tightness in her chest. She thought about the schoolhouse, about the road she had been traveling for 2 years, always moving, never stopping, because stopping meant facing what she had left behind. I don't know how to stay, she said quietly. Samuel nodded. Neither do I. They sat in silence, the fire burning low between them. Above, the stars were thick and bright, scattered across the sky like salt. After a while, Miriam spoke again. There was a place I passed, maybe 2 days before I came to Cibola, a valley with a creek running through it. Cottonwoods, good grass. I saw the remains of a cabin, just the foundation and part of a chimney. Looked like it had been empty a long time. Samuel looked at her. You think we could make it back there? Maybe, if we're careful. And if someone owns it? Miriam shrugged. Then we ask, or we move on. Samuel considered this. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded and worn. He unfolded it carefully and held it toward the firelight. Miriam leaned closer. It was a land deed, old and stained, with a name written in careful script at the top. The name had been crossed out. Found this in the cage, Samuel said. Someone must have dropped it. I kept it, don't know why. He looked at the paper, then at her. Thought maybe it could be useful someday. Miriam stared at the deed. You want to claim the land? I want to have a reason to stay, Samuel said. A paper reason if it comes to that. Something that says we belong somewhere. Miriam thought about this. A deed was just a piece of paper, but paper carried weight in a world governed by law. It was proof. It was permission. It was a name written down and recognized. We'd have to file it, she said, at a land office. That means going back toward towns, toward people who might be looking for us. I know, it's a risk. Everything is. Miriam looked at him across the fire. His face was thin and tired, marked by bruises that had faded to yellow and green. But his eyes were steady. He was not running anymore. He was choosing. She reached up and touched the tin button she had tied to a cord around her neck. It was small and solid, a piece of someone else's story that she now carried. All right, she said. We'll go back. We'll find the valley, and we'll stay. Samuel nodded slowly. Then he held out his hand, palm up. Miriam looked at the hand, scarred and calloused, offered without words. She placed her own hand in his. They sat like that for a long time, holding on while the fire burned down to coals and the night grew cold around them. The next morning, they packed the camp and turned the horses south. The journey back took 2 days. They moved carefully, avoiding the main roads, keeping to the hills where they could see anyone coming from a distance. On the second afternoon, they found the valley. It was just as Miriam remembered, a wide stretch of green along a clear creek, bordered by cottonwoods that rustled in the wind. The remains of the cabin sat on a low rise, the stone chimney still standing, the foundation intact. They dismounted and walked through the tall grass, their boots swishing softly. The air smelled of water and earth, and the faint sweetness of wild clover. Samuel knelt beside the foundation and ran his hand over the stones. Good work, he said. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Miriam looked around the valley, at the hills rising on either side, at the way the light fell golden across the creek. It was quiet. It was far from everything. It was a place where 2 people could disappear if they wanted to, or a place where they could begin. We'll need to rebuild, she said. Yes, it'll take time. We have time. Miriam looked at Samuel, kneeling in the grass with the sun on his back and the valley spread out before him. He looked different now. Not free of the past. She did not think either of them would ever be free of that, but no longer crushed by it. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on the stone foundation, still worn from the sun. Then let's stay, she said. Samuel turned to her and smiled. It was the second time she had seen him smile, and it was easier now, less guarded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the deed. He unfolded it and looked at the crossed-out name, then took a pencil stub from his coat and wrote two new names in the margin, Samuel and Miriam. It was not legal, it was not official, but it was theirs. He folded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket. Then he stood and offered her his hand. Miriam took it and rose to her feet. Together, they looked out over the valley, at the place they had chosen, at the home they would build. The echo and the legend, years later. Travelers passing through that country would sometimes speak of a valley where smoke rose steady from a stone chimney, even in the heart of summer. They said a man and a woman lived there, far from any town, far from any road that had a name. Some said they were fugitives. Others said they were simply people who had chosen silence over the noise of the world. No one knew for certain, because those who lived in the valley did not come to town. And the few who ventured close enough to see the cabin said the couple kept to themselves, working the land with quiet determination, their lives marked by the rhythm of seasons rather than the judgments of men. The cabin they built was small, but solid, with walls of stone and timber and a roof that did not leak. Samuel had done most of the heavy work, cutting logs and setting them in place, while Miriam mixed clay and stone to fill the gaps. They worked side by side, day after day, until the structure stood complete and the chimney drew smoke cleanly into the sky. They planted a garden in the spring, corn, beans, squash. Miriam tended it with the same care she had once given to her students, kneeling in the dirt to pull weeds and check the soil. Samuel built a fence to keep out the deer and the rabbits, and at night they sat on the porch he had constructed from split logs and watched the stars emerge over the hills. They did not speak of Cibola. They did not speak of the cage or the trial or the long ride north. Those things lived in them still, carried quietly like the button and the ribbon they each wore. But they had learned that some stories did not need telling. Some stories simply were. In the second year, a man came to the valley. He rode a gray horse and wore a badge on his vest, though the metal was tarnished and the leather of his belt was cracked with age. He was not the sheriff from Cibola. He was someone else, from some other jurisdiction, following some other trail. He stopped at the edge of the property and called out. Samuel emerged from the cabin, a hatchet in his hand, not raised but ready. Miriam stood in the doorway behind him, her arms crossed. The man looked at them both for a long moment. Then he dismounted and walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "I'm looking for a man named Samuel," he said. Last name unknown, accused of desertion. Samuel did not move. Why? The man shrugged. Because someone paid me to. Who? Does it matter? Samuel considered this. Then he set the hatchet down and stepped forward. "I'm Samuel." The man studied him, his eyes moving from Samuel's face to the cabin behind him, to Miriam standing in the doorway, to the garden and the fence, and the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. "You build all this?" the man asked. "Yes." "Just the two of you?" "Yes." The man nodded slowly. He looked tired, Miriam thought. Tired in the way that came from chasing things that no longer mattered. "They're still looking for you," the man said. "Army doesn't forget." "I know." "But I'm a long way from where I started," the man continued. "And I'm not as young as I used to be. Gets harder every year, riding out to the middle of nowhere, for men who probably don't deserve hanging anyway." He glanced at Miriam, then back at Samuel. "You planning to cause trouble?" "No." "You planning to leave?" "No." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He looked at it, then tore it in half. He let the pieces fall to the ground. "I never found you," he said. Samuel stared at him. "Why?" The man smiled, faint and weary. "Because I'm tired, and because some things aren't worth finding." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted and looked at them one last time. "You take care of each other." Then he rode away, back toward the hills, and did not look back. Miriam stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Samuel. They watched the man disappear into the distance, a small shape against the wide sky. "Do you think he'll come back?" Miriam asked. "No." "Do you think others will?" Samuel shook his head. "Maybe, but not for a long time." They stood together in the warm afternoon light, the valley quiet around them, the creek murmuring over stones. Somewhere a hawk cried, high and distant. That night they sat by the fire, as they always did. Miriam was mending a shirt, her needle moving in small, careful stitches. Samuel was carving a piece of wood, shaping it slowly into something that might become a cup or a bowl. "Do you ever think about going back?" Miriam asked. Samuel looked up from his carving. "To where?" "Anywhere. A town. People." He considered the question. "No," he said finally. "Do you?" Miriam thought about the schoolhouse, about the children's voices that still echoed in her memory, bright and fleeting. She thought about the graves and the road and the years he had spent running. "No," she said, "not anymore." Samuel nodded and returned to his carving. Miriam tied off the thread and folded the shirt. They did not need to say more. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, a sound like water or like breathing. In the years that followed, the valley became a place that existed mostly in rumor. Some said the couple who lived there had once been outlaws. Others said they were simply people who had lost too much and found each other in the losing. A few claimed they had seen the woman in town once, years later, buying supplies with coins so old they might have come from another century. But no one could say for certain. What was certain was this: the smoke continued to rise from the stone chimney, season after season, year after year. The garden grew, the fence held, and two people who had been strangers, then companions, then something deeper and unnamed, made a life in the quiet places where the world did not reach. It carried the dead with them always, Thomas and Anna and all the others whose names were written in memory rather than stone. But they carried each other too, and that was enough. The land remembers everything. It remembers the ones who pass through and the ones who stay. It remembers the broken and the mended, the lost and the found. And in that valley, where the creek runs clear and the cottonwoods grow tall, the land remembers two people who chose to stop running. Some say they are there still,